Dr. Michael Battle. We have a good group gathered here in Tresvant Hall, and we continue each week at 9:30 offering programs in person, in a hybrid way, in person and also online. So thank you for joining us. Before we begin, a prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, on this new day, this first Sunday in Lent, we give thanks for an opportunity to gather, to reflect, to give thanks for your church throughout the world. We remember especially Desmond Tutu of blessed memory. Give thanks for Dr. Michael Battle, who is with us to reflect, to engage us on our journeys. Be with us as we go about this time, go about this day, living more fully and deeply into who we're called to be, especially in Lent. Amen. So, the spirituality, ministry, and impact of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I'm so thrilled that Michael is here. I've had the privilege of knowing Michael for over almost 12 years as we were thinking back. He and I both worked together with Episcopal Credo, which is a wellness benefit of the Episcopal Church, and got to know each other very well, and both have served as spiritual faculty for Credo. But we had a way to stay connected in many ways. And in 2017, I had the opportunity to take sabbatical in South Africa, and Michael is who connected me with some of the places where I stayed and served when I was there for 2 weeks. And many of you know, just from knowing me by now, you hear a lot about Desmond Tutu from me. His impact has been very important to my own life, and Michael has had an incredible journey with him. And so we have an opportunity today to hear from Michael, and just so I invite you to join me in welcoming him today. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Father Ollie. Thank you all for having such an interest and to see so many people here for an adult forum. I'm not really used to this, even though I do this all the time. I'm not really used to seeing so many people in an adult forum. So thank you all for being here. Hopefully you can all see me, especially those streaming. And if you're having any trouble, just let the powers that be know so that you can hear me and see me via streaming. I just wrote a book on Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It came out in March, and as we have tried to promote this book, of course, it was very difficult to do during COVID. And also, I was mindful of how the Arch was turning 90, and he turned 90 on October 7th. And so I wanted this book to not only be an academic sort of approach to his life and his legacy, but I also made a commitment in the book to name him as a saint. Now, when you name someone as a saint and you know the person well, it's not extremely objective. Is that correct? This is when I was able to work with Archbishop Tutu and serve de facto as a chaplain. I lived with him in 1993 and 1994. And why I think he's a saint is because he's just as authentic behind the scenes as he is in front of thousands of people. He prays about 7 times a day, kind of like a Cistercian Trappist monk. And he also would take time to be with children. He would go, if he was doing visits to churches, he'd go in the back and meet those who were doing all the work, the Marthas, those who are active, those behind the scenes. So my claim is that he is a saint. And the difficulty around Archbishop Tutu is that he is caught in this kind of Hollywood trajectory. You're typecast, right? So if you are Meryl Streep. She's one of the only few who can do dramas and comedies. Well, I think Tutu is like a Meryl Streep. He is not just political. He is deeply spiritual. And in our day and age in which we are seeing the fragility of another world war, a third world war, the fragility of leadership, we need to promote people and people's lives that are a part of the solution rather than the problem. And unfortunately, the church, in many ways, has been on the wrong side of history, has condoned slavery, has kept people out of the church, has condoned civil religion and colonizing the world, has spread along with the gun, forcing people to do things around the world. Unfortunately, the church has not always been a part of the solution. And when we have one example, like Tutu's life, we've got to take it out from under a bushel and put that light on a hill. And especially for us who are Anglicans, after all that we've been through in our civil wars and culture wars, we need to hold up a saint among us. Also, just to show you that my work is not simply some objective work, he also ordained me a priest. And in so doing, he eternally created a bond with me as the bishop who vicariously, through the Holy Spirit, has ordained me into the church. I feel kind of like a biblical writer of recording someone's life and theology and needing to let the world know, because many people do not want to know about the brilliance of Tutu. Many people do not want to practice the consciousness of God. Many people do not want restorative justice. Many people do not want to confess their sins. Many people do not want to be a real Christian. And so Tutu, when he ordained me, he invited me into this difficulty of keeping people conscious, which I'll preach about for those of you who did not come this morning, about the problem of staying conscious in the presence of each other, and mostly in the presence of God. I want just to play a short clip for those of you who may not know much about Archbishop Tutu, so let me just go ahead and do that.
Desmond Tutu was born in 1931 in an impoverished township in South Africa. He wanted to be a doctor, but wound up a parish priest and a prophet.
For until blacks are free, no one in this country is going to be free.
For 30 years, he was a leader in his people's struggle to end apartheid, the rule of white supremacy.
If you think you can stop us from becoming free, you are going to be stampeded.
The course was hard and costly.
The system tries all it can to destroy us. It won't succeed. God is on our side.
In 1984, Tutu was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. 1 year later, even as his own people still could not vote, the Anglican Church enthroned him as the first black archbishop in South Africa. In 1994, millions of black South Africans, including Tutu, voted for the first time. Nelson Mandela was elected president. Mandela asked Archbishop Tutu to chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Its mandate was to document the horrors of apartheid and to sow the seeds of reconciliation between blacks and whites.
We do want to forgive, but we don't know who to forgive because we don't know the killers, you know?
He had a gun in his hand pointed at my forehead.
The act of opening the magazine was the detonating device for a bomb.
And then they said to me, today you are going to die.
During that period, you were suffocated.
How did you manage to sit there day after day and hear these stories of terrible things that people had been doing to other people?
It was terrible, but I cry easily. That is, I mean, I broke down on the very first day, but I then said it wasn't fair. God, you couldn't allow this to happen because the media then concentrated on me instead of on the people who were the rightful subjects, the victims. And if I wanted to cry, then I would cry at home or in church. But I was sustained by prayer, yeah.
What was the worst thing about apartheid?
Ultimately, it's actually when it makes you doubt that you are a child of God. When you are subjected to treatment that begins to work in here, and you begin to say, hey, maybe they are right. Language is very powerful. Language does not just describe reality. Language creates the reality it describes. And so when we call you a non-European, a non-this, you might think it isn't working on you. But in fact, it is corrosive of your self-image. You end up wondering whether you are actually as human as those others.
This report that your commission released has been called one of the most important documents of the 20th century. What would you like of it for the world to take to heart?
I would hope, that the world would realize that there is no situation that is not transfigurable.
I end with that clip to encourage us in the existential reality of Ukraine and Russia, that there is no reality, no conflict that cannot be transformed and transfigured. So just a short clip, just to invite you in. Bill Moyers, as you know, is an excellent person who does documentaries. You can look that up on PBS, maybe on YouTube for the fuller bio on Archbishop Tutu. Just want to say a little bit about what I think is powerful about his theology and his spirituality, which is not focused on naturally, right, in the media. They basically just want him to be a politician. That he's a deep spiritual person, contemplative, that's not sexy enough in our media to really care about. So as I started out, I feel as though it's my job to try to articulate the power of someone like Tutu is not located simply in being a politician. Tutu's theology comes out of the struggle against apartheid, and you saw him in an excellent way of articulating what happens when you live in that system. You internalize it. Even though you might fight against it, you internalize it. And so with apartheid, we don't necessarily understand it because we're in the US, but in South Africa, the government created a system called apartheid. So it was a legal system of separation. But it was more than that. It was a spirituality. Apartheid was a spirituality. In Afrikaans, apartheid means to be set apart. And those of you who know biblical language, what is the definition of the word to be holy? To be set apart, yes. Apartheid was a spirituality in which those who were Afrikaners, and the British are not innocent in this as well, very much culpable in this problem of apartheid. But apartheid was this way of understanding an Afrikaner person or European person being called by God to make Africa a civilized world. And it was a spirituality that was fought against by other early clergy people, British clergy people, like John Colenso. John Colenso went to South Africa, and the way the system was, you couldn't have a black bishop, you had to have a British bishop in the Anglican Church. He went and fell in love with South African people, with indigenous people, with the Zulu. And so he wanted to translate the Book of Common Prayer and the Bible into Zulu, and he wanted the Zulu to have prominent roles in the church. And lo and behold, they called John Colenso back to the principal's office, and they created the first Lambeth Conference. Do you all know what the Lambeth Conferences are, when all the bishops gather every 10 years? Well, did you know it was started because of John Colenso? They brought bishops together to excommunicate John Colenso and the work that he was doing in South Africa. Also, what's important is to understand that apartheid was started by a Dutch Reformed minister. He was one of the people. Of course, there were a lot of people. An ordained Dutch Reformed minister, D.F. Malan, was the first prime minister of South Africa, and in 1948, apartheid was official. Also in 1948, the British were involved with dividing up the Holy Land. 1948 was a very important year of sort of the collapse of the British Empire, and the sun was actually going down on the British Empire. But he's a Dutch Reformed minister, articulated apartheid, and this is why I have this argument that apartheid is not simply a political system, but a spiritual one. Tutu's crucial theology is Ubuntu, which is a proverb. I am because you are, and because you are, I am. In the European Enlightenment, the proverb was, I think, therefore I am. In a European worldview, everything is more individualistic. But in the proverb of Ubuntu, I cannot be who I am if you are not being who you are. And it's not about codependence. It's a way of understanding identity. You cannot know you are unique in your humor if no one laughs at your jokes. You can't know if you're beautiful unless someone is attracted to you. It's a rational, philosophical way of understanding human identity. It's not codependence. And so Ubuntu was this African cultural worldview that actually is a theological worldview. The way that we make sense of God as three persons is Ubuntu. That Jesus' identity is in the Father and the Spirit. The Father's identity is in the Son and the Spirit. The Spirit's identity is in the Father and the Son. They are interdependent. They can't be who they are as persons without the other persons being who they are. So the African worldview of Ubuntu and the theological worldview of the Trinity go hand in hand, and Tutu made this a profound concept theologically. And I think this is part of his legacy. Also part of his legacy is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. When we think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we find controversy because what happened is in 1996, Nelson Mandela was trying to figure out how to heal his country. He didn't want a perpetual civil war. And he had, fortunately enough, someone who had the authority to gather the nation state in Archbishop Tutu. Of course, Nelson Mandela could gather South Africa through his authority and his biblical epic life of being in prison for 27 years and then becoming the president of a nation state. It's like a biblical story. He had that kind of authority, but he didn't have the spiritual authority. And Mandela's wisdom was that he needed someone who could bring the country together, not based on retributive justice, but restorative justice. Not a justice that's an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, but a justice that could restore this identity of all South Africans joining one identity. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if between 1960 and 1994, if you confessed whatever crime that you were guilty of in the name of you thinking that you were trying to defend your own political side, if you would go to one of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and stand in public and say what you did, if you confessed it, you could be given amnesty. Now, these hearings were led by Archbishop Tutu, wore his purple cassock, led these hearings in, the Lord's Prayer, stopped and said prayer every now and then. That's what Mandela's wisdom was, that South Africa needed not just a political gravity to bring people together, but a spiritual one as well. So Tutu's legacy is his theology, his spirituality of Ubuntu, but most in the secular world, when all encyclopedias and history books are written, Tutu will be known for his leadership of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I just want to play a clip about this.
Desmond Tutu's contribution to South Africa did not stop here. He had planned to leave his home in Cape Town and retire to America and spend time with his grandchildren. But then Nelson Mandela asked him to lead the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was a request that the Archbishop could not turn down.
It heard from the victims of apartheid and heard the stories of the victims, which was an enormously emotional process.
Nokhle Mohapi was the first to take the stand. Her husband, Mapetla, died in custody 20 years ago. The authorities claimed it was suicide. I want help, she said. I want the truth because I know that my husband never killed himself.
Desmond Tutu knew that without confronting the past, South Africa could not move forward, and he wanted to hear from all those affected by apartheid.
The Archbishop was very keen to hear, as he said, the stories of the little people, not necessarily the big famous stories about which there was already considerable evidence, but stories of people in small towns, in faraway places whose suffering had been ignored for so long.
Mary Burton worked with Desmond Tutu throughout the commission and sat with him through all the testimonies.
It was an enormous task. There were altogether close on 22,000 statements made to us in those years.
And then he fell down on the pavement and he died about half an hour later.
It was often very heartbreaking, the sheer magnitude of the suffering and the repeated stories and the fact that so many people had been ignored and suffered in silence for so long. I think everybody who was part of the Truth Commission was changed by it to some extent.
Desmond Tutu himself was deeply affected by the stories he heard.
He responded within the first day or two by breaking down at one stage. And after that, he got upset with himself and discussed it with Leah and said, this shouldn't be about me. This should be about the victims. I'm going to take attention away from the victims unless I can learn to control my emotions. And thereafter, you would see him biting his hand like that when he was getting emotional to ensure that the focus remained on the victims.
Oh, Holy Spirit, calm the turmoil within.
The commission was a government initiative and not overtly religious, but the fact that the Archbishop was the chair did have a significant influence.
Amen.
We discussed in the Commission's meeting whether the Archbishop should wear his purple robes at the hearing, and the majority view was that he shouldn't. And we said so really quite strongly. This is not a religious commission. And the Archbishop listened to all of these arguments, and then he said, the people want it. And he was quite right. The people, particularly the victims who were testifying, whether they were Christian or not, they wanted to shake his hand. They wanted to be touched by him. His presence was important to them. And his purple robes lent a solemnity to the occasion that I think was very important. So he had that sense of what people wanted and what people needed and what he could give to them.
Despite the fact that terrible crimes were being recalled, forgiveness, something at the heart of Christianity, was central to the Commission's aims.
The raison d'etre for this commission is opening wounds, cleansing them so that they do not fester, and saying we have dealt with our past as effectively as we could. We have not denied it. We have looked the beast in the eye.
I think we all learned a great deal during the commission about forgiveness, about how you reach it, about the fact that most people don't reach it, about the fact that even if you do it once, you actually have to, in a way, keep on and on forgiving if you want to be healed and be sane after terrible suffering.
One of the things that the Archbishop made very clear was the fact that forgiveness is not easy. And he would often say that you are in love with your wife. You do something wrong, and even in the privacy of your bedroom, it is hard to say, I'm sorry. And here we are asking people publicly, in the glare of television cameras, to say sorry for a very horrendous deed. And the Archbishop was just trying to show that forgiveness is not cheap.
You led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You got those people who'd been tortured to face those people who had done the torturing and presided over tremendously difficult stories.
Yes, it was just that incredible, it was an incredible privilege. Sitting, presiding, and really being humbled by the incredible magnanimity, the generosity of spirit.
But forgiveness, when you sat in that Truth and Reconciliation Commission and you hear your own people sobbing and telling you stories of their own torture, of the loss of their loved ones.
Yeah.
How do you start? How would you tell somebody how to start to forgive?
Well, we didn't have to tell them. And we, as I say, had the privilege of sitting there and listening to the stories. And people generally moved on because there is something therapeutic about telling your story. It's that you are being acknowledged. You're not a cipher. You are someone, and that is something that says, yes, the suffering that you underwent was not just something that said poof into the sky. It contributed to the freedom we are now enjoying.
So I close with that insight that suffering can be redemptive. But it doesn't mean that we impose suffering on others, and those in power impose suffering for their own metric of what the redemption should look like. That's not what Tutu is saying. But that a way of seeing a community struggling together is a way of acknowledging Ubuntu, that I cannot win if you lose. And if you lose, then we will have a perpetual conflict that will go on from generation for people not even born yet. The beauty of Tutu's spirituality I put together in the book under Christian mysticism. And Christian mysticism is a three-stage process, starting with purgation, illumination, and union. Purgation exposes, makes us conscious of the wrong, the conflict, the sin. It helps us to see what needs to be cleansed. And when we see it, that naturally moves to the second stage of illumination. Illumination gives us the ability to see where to go, but most of all, who to be. And that leads us to the third stage of Christian mysticism, union with God. Because ultimately in Christian mysticism, our goal is to be one with God, to live completely as uninhibited as possible with God, to align our will with God. So I close with you in terms of how I tried to write my book, but I also wanted you to see, hopefully, because most of communication, they say 80% of communication is nonverbal. So I'm hoping that just by seeing the presence and the mannerisms of Tutu, you could see why I've dedicated most of my own vocational theology and vocation as a professor, theologian, to trying to make Archbishop Tutu known in a world that desperately needs his kind of leadership. And I know that we're going to close now, but I'm going to play a 2-minute segue into what we're going through right now, especially with Russia and Ukraine. And this comes from Francis Fukuyama, who is a Stanford politician. And he's a prophet too, Francis Fukuyama. And he's predicting what is going on, I think, with our world of not trusting institutions and how we are so vulnerable because we do not understand how we are dependent on one another.
My name is Francis Fukuyama. I'm a senior fellow at Stanford and director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and a political scientist. Someone mentioned this concept that I'd not heard of previously called a post-truth society, in which it's possible to assert things that have no factual basis. People will criticize it, fact checkers, and it makes no difference whatsoever, that people will keep asserting it, and then other, large numbers of people will keep believing it, even if it's not true. And that's an effect that's going to last way beyond the election, unfortunately. I think that once you sort of breach these norms, you're in this undefined territory where anything can go, and I don't think we've plumbed the depths of that, unfortunately. I think that a post-truth society it's a reflection of something deeper, which is the basic lack of authority or the decline of authority of institutions across the board. And this is not just in the United States, this is in Europe and other places as well. So if you think about the things that defined our society, they were corporations, labor unions, a family, churches, political parties, these are the things that structured our social and political life. Every single one of those, if you look at polling data over the last 40, 50 years, every single one of those institutions has seen a decline in the number of people saying they trust those institutions. The causes of this, I think, are kind of complicated. I think actually technology plays a role, because a lot of these institutions have actually become much, much more transparent. And when people actually see the way that they function in reality, they don't like it, even though there's actually been no change. And so, for example, I suspect if you actually look at police shootings over time. It's been declining along with the crime rate over the last 30 years, but now that you've got body cameras and people with smartphones, it's much more visible because ordinary citizens can take videos of things that have been happening for the last, couple of generations. So I think that's something that's been going on across the board that's led to this steady erosion in the confidence in public institutions.
I close with St. Francis of Assisi to give us hope. Start by doing what's necessary, then do what's possible. And suddenly you're doing the impossible. So thank you all. Any questions? We have about 7 minutes.
10, 15.
Questions, comments, pushback, homilies. Keep them short. Right here. Here's one here.
We have a roaming mic here. There you go.
In the work of the Reconciliation Commission, you heard from people who had done wrong, who came in and confessed and asked for forgiveness. To what extent did amends then follow?
Yeah, so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up to provide recommendations to Mandela and to the cabinet. And so they gathered all of these testimonials, and then they submitted what they thought were recommendations for reparations. And so they did that. But Tutu was hit on both sides because he was seen as, on the black side, he was seen as a sellout of not really doing true justice. And then he was hit by the white side, of course, as being attacking whatever was going to happen with my assets and reparations, especially as you probably know about South Africa, the farmland and the relocation of farmland. But Tutu didn't recommend that the farmland be given back, but he did recommend reparations such as schools, healthcare, a certain amount of care to reestablish those who never had access to land. So it's true, he did offer reparations, but you can only, as a commissioner, you can only recommend. And the ANC appropriated some of those recommendations, but not all of them. But the spin in the media is that the TRC was only about forgiveness. And so they associate that to Tutu, who naturally was big enough to understand that criticism, but his turn of retributive justice to restorative justice, I think, was his key maneuver in the political world. Others? Yes?
Good morning. My name is Laura Geddes. It's good to have you here. Thank you for being here. My question is also on Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Recently, there was a group that was hearing about and reading about a TRC that's taken place in this country. It was in Maine, and it was around a conversation with those Native Americans in Maine who had had family members or themselves be removed from their household and relocated into other families, white families. And this was the first TRC that I'm aware of in this country. And I'm wondering about your thoughts around further TRCs in this country as well.
Yeah, I think we need to start with the TRC in our church.
Say more.
I think the Anglican Church needs a TRC, and to do it in a creative, contextual, particular way. I think whoever the next Archbishop of Canterbury could be a really good leader in that. We've had about 12 TRCs in the United States. Greensboro was one in North Carolina. They had a TRC. Maine had one. But because of what I was trying to say in terms of the media coverage, you didn't get very much media coverage on those TRCs because it didn't really have authoritative figures like Tutu and others. I think William Barber is close to having that kind of authority. I don't know if you know. Do you know who William Barber is? Okay, so you see what I mean about the authority needed for such a TRC to have teeth. But I agree with you. We will, just like the former Soviet Union, unless we purge the latent conflicts and are aware of them, we will repeat them. And the United States has an opportunity, I think, based on the structure, the way that we've set up government, that we can actually practice a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We can do it through the government. Because legally, there have been gross violations of human rights written into legal structures of slaves never getting what was legally appropriated to them. So maybe there are creative ways to appropriate reparations, such as moving not only high schools economically to be free, but colleges as well. Maybe that could be one approach to reparations through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Yes?
You knew Desmond Tutu. What kind of a man was he?
Yeah, why don't you, just so that they can hear you.
From your personal experience, what kind of man was he?
He could have been a stand-up comedian. And that seems to be a pattern these days, right, with leaders, stand-up comedians. Deep sense of humor to disarm a room, because naturally he is a magnet for conflict. So he knew how to disarm a room to be able to get his message across. Very loyal to his family. Very courageous. When I served as his chaplain, was one of the heart of the violence. And the phones would ring through my chaplain's house on the premises of Bishop's Court, where the Arch lived, and I would hear these calls that would come through threatening his life. It was like a horror movie, just the things that they said that they were going to do to him. So very courageous. He had when I lived with him, he had no bodyguards. So hopefully he wasn't depending on me to be the bodyguard. He depended on his purple cassock to protect him as he led marches. He was a man, obviously, of deep faith, trained by monks, the Community of the Resurrection. And I write in my book, my children, when I was writing that section, said, I'm trying to describe Tutu like a superhero, like Batman or something. You know, I'd have to go away and be trained by monks. But that indeed was Tutu. He was trained by monks ever since a child. So those are some things. Read the book.
Well, Michael, thank you. Thank you, friends, and let us give thanks for Michael's presence. We'll be here next week with Bishop Jeff Lee, retired Bishop of Chicago, talking a lot about the prayer book and liturgy and what we have done in our tradition for a very long time. And there's information in Life at GSL on the website, the e-news, so please avail yourself to all of that information and continue to encourage others to gather in person and online for what we offer in formation at Grace St. Luke's. Go in peace.